Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the December 19th Budget Commission meeting, the last one of 2024. Woot woot. I am Katie Howard. I am your chair, and with that, I will let Ms. Hairston call the roll, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representing Educational District 1, Ms. Katie Howard.
Present.
Representing Educational District 2, Ms. Aretta Bowden.
Present.
Representing Educational District at Large, Seat 9, Ms. Jessica Johnson.
Present.
Also present on Zoom, we have Madam General Counsel Shara Shaw.
And we will be joined by Dr. Johnson, our superintendent, and of course, we have CFO Bracken and her team here. Thank you so much, everyone. So thank you, everyone, for being here. And I will move on to a motion to approve the November 21st Budget Commission minutes. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right. And with that, we need to approve the agenda for today. Everyone should have a copy of that. Do I have a motion to approve today's agenda?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Great. Well, let's move right into our discussion items. I'll hand it over to CFO Bracken.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So yes, we have just a couple of items to discuss today. Historically, our December Budget Commission meeting, we've kind of had it as tentative on the calendar. By this point in the process, we've adopted our parameters. We've gotten some guidance, but we really haven't built the budgets yet or have enough information around revenue to be able to make a lot of decisions. So there's not a ton for us to cover at this point in time as the team works to get ready to release the budgets in January. However, we do have two updates this month that we did think were timely and we wanted to go ahead and bring for the Budget Commission to weigh in on. The first, of course, is the House Bill 581 statewide homestead exemption. We've talked about this a few times now. We are at a point in the process where we will need to make a recommendation to the full board and know which direction we're going as far as opting in or opting out of statewide homestead exemption, because we do have a very quick turnaround in a process if we do decide to opt out. So I'll walk through that again for you this morning. And then I'll spend a little bit of time of just giving you an update of where we are with our school allotment formula. School budgets are set to be released January 15th. So when we get back from the break, we'll have a very short period of time for us to turn around and build those budgets out. So we're going to give you some ideas of where we are in planning for that process.
And I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second. I
Yeah.
apologize. I want to make sure to recognize our colleague, Cynthia Briscoe-Brown. She's been here since the beginning of the meeting, so thank you for being here today. I apologize.
Okay, great. So just as a reminder, the state homestead exemption already exists today. It is a flat rate. It's $2,000, and it's an exemption from both county and school taxes. And that's for any property that does have that homestead exemption. On top of that, APS already has a $50,000 homestead exemption in place. That's a flat rate. That is a regressive opportunity as values go up. That is a lower percentage of your property, but on lower valued homes, that is a very high percentage of tax relief for homeowners. So the homestead exemption is applied after the assessed value. So basically, we would take the fair value of your home, then that is assessed at 40%. And then that exemption is the $50,000 is subtracted from that, and then our millage rate is applied to that amount. This a floating homestead exemption would go on top of those already in place exemptions. There was some discussion about whether or not the floating exemption would apply before or after the flat rate, which would then determine how much it impacts us. We got some guidance just last week that it would be applied before, so it would be a higher loss for the district when that is applied. Basically, they would assess the value of a home in 2024, and that would become the base year. So the value of your home in 2024 would be locked in. And then going forward in 2025, they would take that value and they would apply some CPI rate. As I'm assuming that's the national CPI. We're still waiting to get word on exactly what that inflationary rate would be that gets applied to that 2024. And that's what you will pay taxes on. Everything above your actual assessed value and that amount is the exemption. So that exemption grows each year as your values tend to grow at a rate that is higher than the national average CPI. The caps are only applied to the M&O. We don't have a debt millage though, so it doesn't apply for that. It would be our entire M&O or maintenance and operation millage rate that is exempted. There is a process for us to opt out, but we have to do that by March 1st. It looks very, very similar to what we're used to doing when we adopt our millage rate every year. So it does require that we advertise a tax increase. In this case, we will advertise that we are opting out of the exemption. We can start that process as early as January 1st. We would have to have 3 public hearings. Those public hearings have to be advertised in a local organ. For us, that's the AJC. We have to get our ads to the AJC a week in advance of those ads running, so we have to back map all of this process. At the final hearing, the board would need to adopt a resolution, and then we would file that resolution with the Georgia Secretary of State. And then if all of that happens before March 1st, we would be opted out of the statewide homestead exemption. So this is the way that we've currently lined this timeline up for us. We would not be able, because we can't advertise before January 1st, we can't start the process until January 1st, there would be no way for us to hold any of the first hearings in conjunction with our January board meeting. So still trying to piggyback off of existing meetings on the calendar, we're recommending that the first hearing would be, this is more information. I'll skip here, would be at the January 3rd board meeting. We can hold 2 in a day as long as one is after work hours. So we would do one at 10 a.m. and one at 6 p.m. And then we would have our third hearing at a called meeting a week later on February 10th. And so all of our advertisements would follow from that. Very strict constraints around those advertisements. They do have to be not less than 30 square inches. We have to have very specific language that is already written into the referendum that we would need to put into that ad. And again, we would adopt a resolution also that's pretty scripted, and that would need to go to the state secretary. Just an update on where other districts are at this point in time. Even more have opted out since the last time, or have come forward saying that they're opting out. Since the last time we spoke, about 76 districts have said they would opt out. Only 21 have decided they would opt in. Still a lot undecided, probably decided, but waiting until January to get a better sense of where we are. But again, that timeline's very quick. So in January, we'll hear where all the districts are landing and be ready to move based on that. So again, I just wanted to offer what current tax relief is available for our citizens. So our current exemption is $50,000 for anyone with a homesteaded property. And then we have other age and income-based exemptions that are already available to homeowners. That includes a age and income-based exemption of $25,000. There is a $100,000 exemption for tax for seniors age 65 and older that did pass, but it was not on referendum, and so that will still need to go to voters. But once that's gone to voters, we will see that tax relief come up as well. We are also providing some additional resources. You can get additional information around how to apply for the homestead exemption at the Fulton County Tax Assessor's Office or the DeKalb Tax Assessor's Office. We have other displacement grants available, and information about that is here. And then just other additional resources, so discounts, services, especially targeted for seniors. And all of these QR codes will take people to get additional information for those areas. Again, next steps, we would want the board to make a recommendation in January to let us know if we should start that opt-out process. Then we would begin the holding those hearings, and we would get those on the schedule and start advertising those and take any questions that you have.
And just to clarify again, February 3rd is when we would have the public hearings if
We
we
would have-
choose to opt out.
We would have two on February 3rd, one at 10 a.m. and one during, as part of our regular board meeting. It would be like our millage hearings where we call to order a special called meeting for public comment for the opt-out. We would close that and then open for your public comment for your regular board meeting.
Excellent. I'm going to start with Loretta.
Thank you. My quick question is on the exemptions. And I'm not sure if you said this, but I just want to clarify. Are those exemptions stackable?
They all stack.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you. I also had a question. So APS has that $50,000 exemption already. Do other districts have similar existing exemptions?
So the really great thing about local exemptions is that you can work with your legislator to do something that works best for your community. And so most districts have some sort of exemption. I would have to see like what their amounts are. We know that some other school districts do already have a type of floating homestead exemption similar to what the state bill would do. And then other districts have a flat rate. So I'm not sure what those amounts are and how they compare to the 50,000. I will say that 2018, I think this was a $30,000 exemption, and we did increase it from 30,000 to 50,000. And at one point that had a sunset provision in it. We also worked with legislators to pull that sunset. So this is a 50,000 recurring homestead exemption.
And so I think that's helpful just to kind of have that historical context of like what Atlanta Public Schools already had in place to alleviate some of the pressure from homeowners. Just curious, if we were to opt out, right, the existing kind of budget deficit that we were looking at, we already baked that the number in as if we were going to opt in, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and so then if we were to opt out, then would we still have the same level of aggressive kind of budget reductions in plan, or are you all envisioning something else to kind of
Yeah. I
cover
think
that?
that we won't have as aggressive in the current year. We'll still be working in the multi-year because we do have our current budget is dependent on fund balance at a rate that we want to get off of. So we have aggressive cuts that we need to make either way. I do think that it allows us more time for some of the harder decisions so that we're able to tier out these cuts over a couple of years instead of trying to get everything done in this fiscal year. You'll see that as part of the budget proposal that we're going to be bringing forward. We're making a lot of cuts and conversation around the central office in this current year. Also having some more scrutiny around our program budgets at the schools. But you're not going to feel a huge pinch in the individual school budgets this year, whereas we might have had to go into like percentage cuts at schools also had we not been able to get a little bit of relief on the revenue side.
That's helpful. And then my last question, thank you for putting together the resources. I think that's really helpful. Where will that information live, and how can we share that as we're communicating with some of our
So this
stakeholders?
PowerPoint is on Assembly. It's also on our budget website. And then we can work with communications to get it posted in a place more broadly on the APS website.
Thank you.
And before leaving that topic, I wanted to just add, again, Senator Estevez's bill, again, it passed because we've been talking about it with the community, but just to be very clear that unfortunately it was not on the referendum. So we will have a little leeway there, but it is coming in terms of targeted tax relief. And that is a significant portion. Of course, it's capped at 10 million, correct?
Yes.
But it's for people more in the middle, not bringing in more than 100,000 annually, 65 years of age or older.
Yeah.
So it's the one that's highlighted, but it won't actually,
It won't go
It
into
won't
effect
affect that.
January 1st. Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure we highlighted that because we've been talking about it, and all of us are very focused on making sure we have that targeted tax relief, and it's a part of that, but it gives us a little more time in terms of APS, but it is something that will be coming for residents who meet those requirements.
Yeah, just kind of as a follow-on to the questions that Jessica was asking. Do we have any estimates of the impact, any round number kind of estimates of the kind of negative impact this would have on our budget if we did not opt out?
Yeah. So we've been running it a few different ways. We have an up to $45 million and as low as maybe $30 million impact. Some of it, it's complicated in the math, but some of it is what I was explaining around depends because it is a percentage exemption. It depends on if you apply that percentage before or after those other homestead exemptions. So we have all those flat rate exemptions. If you apply the percentage increase after you've done all of that flat rate, it's about a $25 million impact to us. If you apply the percentage before all of the other flat rate, which I think is the way it's actually going to be calculated at the tax assessor's office, it's closer to a $30 million impact to us. And then the senior homestead exemption, when that goes into effect, is an additional $10 million that we've built in. So that's where we get up to that $45 million range in tax offsets that we would expect.
Okay, and just one more, because I want to be, as a homeowner and a taxpayer myself, I want to be sure I understand how this works. And I think I'm on slide 5, maybe? Yeah, towards the beginning. So they take my 2024 assessed value, and let me say my 2024 assessed value went up 30% this year. So it's already high. And let's just, for the sake of doing the math, let's say that let's just use $100,000 as the number for that. So $100,000, if we did not opt out, then I would pay no school taxes on that $100,000.
Yes, that's a way to look at that.
Okay.
Well, you would pay you would still pay the school taxes on the $100,000. The difference is, so if your property value just happened to go up 30% again next year.
So now it's $130,000.
So astronomical increase again 2 years in a row, but our CPI was only up 2%.
Okay.
So they're valuing your home at the $100,000 base plus the 2% of an inflationary rate.
So
right?
102,000.
102,000. Your value's 130,000. You'd see the exemption of 28,000.
Got it.
You'd see an
Okay.
exemption written in that is the value of between, right? So we see that in the first year. APS loses the value that we would have gotten on that 28,000.
But let's say my property doubles
Yeah,
in the next 5 years.
exactly.
And
And it's
becomes
only-
200,000, but it's only a 2%
And
increase.
we would never catch up, right? So that's,
We
you
just
never
get
get it
further
back.
behind.
That's correct.
Yeah, and that's what's scary about this.
That's
is
correct.
That we just keep getting further and further behind.
And I think it's important to note too, there's no flexibility. Like once if you opt in, like that's it.
That's it forever.
There's no
Yeah,
way
there's no
to
other
adjust,
opportunity.
and that's something that all school systems have to take very seriously because we have no crystal ball to know what's coming. I also think of people appealing, which they have every right to do. Full transparency, my husband appealed his property tax assessment. But even that freezes, depending upon what the decision is, for 3 years. Like there's so many different things that can affect. I mean, I'm not saying that's a huge impact, but going
adds
back
up.
to, that's not targeted tax relief, but there are tools, and we need to, as we continue to say, work with our partners in this space to make sure people in these different categories are getting the relief that they absolutely deserve. And of course, that we're using their property tax dollar to improve student outcomes very wisely. So just, that's something that I want to make sure the public understands about this
Yeah.
HB 581 too. There's no flexibility there.
And I've got one more question that is related, and that is about assessment of commercial property. We know that commercial property values in this city are between the tax credits and the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, are much lower and have been increasing at a much lower rate than residential property. and I don't know whether you're the person to ask this question or not, but what can we do to improve our tax revenues from commercial property, which would also provide relief to residential homeowners?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So House Bill 581 is actually pretty expansive. It has quite a few components to it. The piece that we talk about mostly is this floating homestead exemption. But there is a component in it that does start to try to tackle that. So currently, you mentioned this, when you do an appeal on your property values, it was locking that in for 3 years, really no matter what. So it was locking in your values whether you lost or won. This says if you win the appeal, it locks it in. If you don't, then it doesn't. It catches it up. And so that's the other piece that you alluded to, is some of the big commercial properties have the ability to really take advantage of some of these loopholes. So as we continue to work with our legislators to kind of remove or peel back some of those loopholes that the commercial properties are able to take advantage of, and continue to work with our tax assessor to make sure that those values are coming in and appropriately valued. That does help take relief off of the tax base overall. The other piece that we'll talk about in January is the TADs. So the TADs, which by design are creating value in the city, that are creating and generating development and creating additional revenue, is another opportunity where commercial values increase. There's a lot of benefit to commercial, and APS gets none of the benefit for that. And so there's an opportunity, as we're continuing to think about how we manage our TADs going forward, to think about how that can come back to APS and we allow us to do more targeted relief and targeted investments for our schools.
Thank you.
Loretta?
So I just wanted to make sure, I'm going back to Cynthia's first question with the examples of the exemption. So in a case, if we were in this space where, in Cynthia's example, her home value doubled in 5 years, but her tax only increased a small percentage, the homeowner still benefits from that value, like in terms of, right? Like that's not impacted. They still now have.
They still have a
double.
$200,000 house, and you can refinance that. You can put a home equity line on that. You can sell it.
Right. I just wanted
so
to.
that value is still there. It's just that we're not receiving the benefit
Yes.
of that increase, so that we can use it for kids.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. Thank you.
Any other questions on this? Any conversation? Okay, so
I think just another point of clarification. This committee or commission would recommend to the full board what we should do, which we would basically adopt at the January meeting to set the process in motion. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I don't know if Cheryl Shaw is on and if she needs to weigh in on that. I don't know if we have to have an approved resolution in January to move forward with this process, or if you're just giving us the go-ahead at that point to move forward with the process, because we will need a final resolution after all of the hearings that says that we have opted out. So I don't know what we need in January to tell us to get started, or if it's just from the board telling us to start holding the hearings.
Okay, that's helpful.
Cheryl,
We
did you hear that question?
Yes, I did, and I can weigh in. I'm thinking, I hope you all can see me.
We can hear
We
you.
can't, but we can hear you.
Okay, great. Sorry, I don't know. My video's on, but I don't know. Anyhow, there is no specific requirement in the law that you hold a vote to implement the opt-out, right? We do recommend, so I think, you can if you would like to do so, but what we're seeing is administration just saying, hey, this is happening. We're going to start the process for opting out, and we're going to bring this, start the advertisements and bring this back to you for vote. Hold public hearings and bring this back to you to vote on in February, because, you could always vote not to opt out even after the public hearings are held, right? So there is no specific requirement of a public vote prior to implementing the public hearings. You can choose to do so, but we do recommend at least some type of statement from the administration be made that, that you're going to start the process.
Right, that helps tremendously. And then Aretta,
So just clarifying, so even though the voters voted to do this, we have the option to opt in and out, and then the public input comes during the public hearings.
Yes.
But we are the ones who will vote yay or not vote, but who will decide which direction that we move forward.
You'll vote on the final resolution after the public hearings that says if we're opting in or out.
Excellent, thank you.
all right, think we're good. We can keep
Okay.
moving. Thank you.
Alrighty. So that's where we are with the revenue front. Again, in January, we'll do a deeper dive into revenue. I appreciate the opportunity to allow us to push that January board meeting to later in the month. That should give us time to hear what the governor is recommending for the state's budget and incorporate that into some of our revenue projections. We'll build out what we're expecting for local revenue at that time. And then also we'll have a deep dive into the tax allocation districts or our TAD. So we're working feverishly right now to update all of our materials for that. The last thing that I'll just briefly cover is where we are with the school allotments. I've had a great opportunity to have a lot of conversations around the school allotments with different groups this year. So we've met with the Teachers Advisory Committee, Principal Advisory Committee. We've met with cluster superintendents a couple of times now. We met with all principals at the principals meetings. And we've had a couple of BFAC meetings where we've had some feedback from the community on these slides. So really hearing from a lot of voices as we move forward. I think the theme of this entire budget year is going to be back to basics. And so we're doing a lot of conversation around how getting back to the core, back to the baseline, back to basics. And then the flexibility, autonomy, innovation is off of a baseline that we've agreed to, instead of just kind of starting from autonomy and then trying to figure out what we would want to see there. And so there's been a lot of consensus around that. Haven't really had anyone push back and say, no, that sounds like an awful idea. So we're moving forward with that. We do have some decision points then, though, which is what is that baseline? What is that allotment that we want to ensure that every school is receiving, that they can afford specific position types, programs, and funding categories? Then what formulas derive that? Then a lot of conversation about what is then held tight or flexible past those allocations, and then what sort of flexibility and discretionary funding is on top of that. And that's where we've gotten the most feedback, is really around the tight flexibility. And that's where we would expect to hear most from our community, because through our GO teams, that's where they leverage a ton of community voice in the budget processes at their individual schools through their GO team authority. And so some of the positions that we've talked about making sure that are in those funding categories are listed here. And from this, we've kind of categorized into buckets that would be tight. So this is a central program allotted allocation, flexible, so that schools can either default to a earned allocation or can pivot off of that earned allocation as long as they have justification, data to support why they are making those moves, and that cluster superintendents have a means to hold them accountable to the outcomes tied to that flexible decision. And then loose is really just around their own master schedule, core classes, how they allocate their supplies and non-personnel. And they've had a lot of flexibility in those areas in the past as well. We've had really great conversations on this slide, and it seems like every group we meet with, we have more categories moving from the outside to the middle. So that's where people have really given a lot of feedback. So some things that we had allocated very tight, we have moving towards flexible. So if you can make the case why your school would want to pivot off an earned allocation for these, and you have data to support it, we want that level of innovation and autonomy still in our schools. However, we're going to have to tie that to some specific outcomes. There are still some categories held tight. Those are really where you see a lot of compliance, reporting, There's really some specificity around why you would want to keep that allocation held tight. There's funding tied to it or something like that. But everything else, we've really moved towards flex. So I'll pause here just to see if there's any feedback, questions, or comments on these categories.
I can start. I'm sure my colleagues may have some as well. And I know I'm getting into the weeds some, but how does the data that we're looking at inform some of the flexibility? It's important to get that principal feedback, but Dr. Johnson, anything you'd like to share?
No, the data will drive. I think as Lisa mentioned, everything. So the cluster superintendents will have conversation with the individual principals, and as they get their budget allocations, and you look at what's loose and what's tight and what's flexible, the expectation will be that they will provide justification and reasoning as to why they want to move something that's flexible in one direction or another, and those justifications will be based on data. Right, it'll be based on the information that's there. Obviously, there are some automatics that are going to happen. So when you look at areas like literacy, or you look at math, or you look at I think about secondary, a particular AP offering, or something that may be. There's a lot that's already baked in already that you can't move from. But there are some options and some optionality. But increasing the level of dialogue and accountability and partnership with the principal and the GO team is what the data, how the data will be leveraged to move the schools forward. So it will absolutely drive the decisions.
Thank you for that. And then the feedback from the community, you referenced GO teams. Can you give some examples of some of that feedback?
Yeah, so I'll say a couple that have been tight in the past that have kind of made their way back towards flexible is like social worker and media specialist. So, and those were pretty loose at one point. They were actually in SSF, and so they were just purchased with dollars. Then we moved them to tight, so they were allocated with no flexibility. And we've gotten feedback that, there were examples when they were in that loose category where schools were doing some really innovative things and meeting the needs of students in different ways through those allocations. And so tight was kind of constraining and tying the hands of some communities, whereas most communities and most principals were fine with the allocations that they received and weren't asking to do a lot of changes with it. But that's why it comes to flex. It's for those exceptions. We want to give those, we are still in an environment where we believe that site-based decisions are, really impactful for our students, and those GO teams weighing in on how they can provide those things to their students in a different way is something we want to still support.
That's great to hear, and just the cadence of checking and accountability with the cluster superintendents for everybody to understand how that works, and then obviously tying it all to outcomes, but absolutely recognizing that some things have been working really well, and now we're really monitoring and measuring those things, which I look forward to that. We're seeing it more in our monitoring sessions around our goals when we tighten our goals too in some of these areas. Thank you.
And I think that's just what you're seeing, the pendulum swinging in the last few years, and now it's coming more towards that middle where, yes, it's flexible with justification and data to support it. And so.
I think it would be helpful to just walk through exactly how, I guess it's slides 17 and 18 sort of interact, because 17 says, these are the things that every school should have at a minimum. But then we get to the next slide where it puts a bunch of those in flexible. And I think we need to make it clear I don't think we're saying that a principal can decide that they don't need any art in their school, right, or they don't need they don't need a social worker. And so if you can talk a little bit about how that flexibility operates.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we've struggled with in the past, there's a few different things that have been challenges as we move to a student success funding formula or a student weighted funding formula. And one of them is you lose the ability to show what the district is funding, right? So we come to board meetings and the board will ask, what is the counselor ratio for each school? And I'm not able to answer that because I don't allocate counselors based on a ratio. I give schools dollars and then they purchase counselors. What we're doing with this slide is saying APS can guarantee that we have funded a sufficient amount of dollars in your school that you can afford a counselor per every 450 students, for example. So we can show that and we'll drop it on their spreadsheet. We'll show them you know, based on your allocation, your enrollment, you can have a counselor, okay? So maybe this school generates 2 counselors based on their enrollment. But when we go to the next slide, they say, you know what, I actually have great partnerships. I have other positions in my building that are helping to supplement and support the work of a counselor. I have grants that I'm using also. So I would like to convert that counselor to a teacher and have lower class sizes in grade 4. And this is how my data supports it. So they're going to go to the cluster soup. They're going to say, I'm going to take those 2 counselors that I earned through my allocation. I'm going to keep one, and this is what I'm going to do with the other dollars. Cluster soup's going to hold me accountable to that throughout the course of the year. They're going to say, are you on track? How are those partners showing up? How's that other position doing? And at the next budget cycle, if that didn't plan out, they say, you need to keep those 2 counselors next year, right? Or they can say, great, looks good. I like the way you did that. We're good going forward. That's how we can demonstrate that we are allocating at least a baseline of services to every school and also be able to demonstrate that flexibility and commitment to the Go Teams weighing in process and also the outcomes that come from that. So we're trying to kind of tell the story of flexibility in a way that it does have demonstrated impact to student outcomes. Right now, we can't show how our flexibility and autonomy and our flexibility in our dollars is actually helping students.
Excellent explanation. Not that I expected anything less from you, but that really, I think, clarifies it for the community that we're not saying a principal can say, okay, we're not ever going to do art ever again in our school, or whatever it is.
And we're still maintaining the standards of service too. So there are certain standards of service that, you know, is a document created by our academics team that says this is what we expect for all schools. And so, you know, principals are navigating against those expectations as well.
Okay, one more question. I'm sorry. Did you have something you wanted to say? Okay. Don't want to? Sorry, I got you. Sorry. Okay. And this goes to a theme that we are hearing in our Breakfast with the Board. Mm-hmm. And every year we seem to have 1 or 2 common themes bubble up across high schools, across the district. And this year's theme seems to be access to advanced coursework, access to AP classes, to IB classes where those are appropriate, to higher level, more rigorous classes. Where is that on this chart? Is that just master schedule and core classes, which is very loose, or is there somewhere else in here that's baked in?
Yeah, so I'll be frank. Like we can't do everything as a district, but we're very sensitive to the desires and demands of individual schools, and this is where the individual conversations with school principals and cluster superintendents, et cetera, makes a lot of difference. So having been a high school principal, and loving, I love master schedules. You have to make intentional decisions about what you offer and what you don't offer, and how do you get access to and for your kids. I will tell you, I could not afford to offer everything as a high school principal. I could not afford to offer everything that my students wanted on my campus. What I could do is figure out how to get them access to almost everything that they wanted, or find an alternative that made a lot of sense. And so, you know, at the building level, when you have limited resources, I think it's one thing we got to be really careful when you have, you know, onesie twosie situations. you have to really think outside of the box about how am I going to get students access. And it might be that I'm partnering with another school. It might be that I'm looking at remote opportunities. It might be that I'm partnering with an external partner. But you can't build a schedule in a fiscally responsible way and still be true to the core areas that you have to offer with a level of intentionality. And not look at your numbers and some of the things. So a lot of that will happen in the master schedule build. Obviously, philosophically, we know the importance and desire to make sure that we offer as many advanced courses and such as we possibly can for students. But then there are some decision points. And then as school principals get to those decision points, I think it also speaks to the point of cross-collaboration across clusters as well. Because we're offering at, school X and not at school Y doesn't mean we can't take advantage of what's being offered in school X or find a partner that can offer it. So there's going to be opportunities for that, and we know that's a desire of a lot of our students and something that will continue to be a desire, but we're going to have to continue to be thoughtful and think outside the box in how we offer it.
Well, and I know we're beginning to do some of that even this year with giving students access to courses that aren't available at their school. And I'm looking forward to seeing the innovative ways that we can come up with to meet that need without having to hire 13 AP Physics teachers, which is literally impossible. So.
And I would add there's probably opportunity will be as we go forward. There's nothing that says we've got 3 high school principals, and this all gets into, thinking about the build of the schedule and am I on the same schedule as others and what do I do? But, there's nothing that says we couldn't find 3 schools that want to offer AP Physics, and that was always one I struggled with, right? I always end up having
What everybody struggles with.
Yeah, I end up having 6 or 7 students that wanted AP Physics, or one year I'd have 11, the next year I'd have 2 or 3, so I'm making the average 6 or 7. And the challenge was on the 2 or 3 year.
Yeah.
How do I stand it up, right? Well, the principal of the school that was 7 miles up the road, there's nothing says that we couldn't share a teacher. That we couldn't, I have not literally half the teacher, but we share the teacher, right? And so maybe Monday and Wednesdays on my campus and Tuesday and Thursdays on the other campus, and then we're figuring out what we're going to do on Friday. So I think we need to be, we should be thinking about some of those things as we look at offerings, but it is cost prohibitive to hire a full-time teacher, right?
For 2 or 3 kids at
right.
every school,
But
absolutely.
the other side of the equation is those 2 or 3 kids should have access to what makes sense for their schedules, and so we've got to think through both lanes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
I'm still trying to formulate my reflection, and so as I'm hearing the words about like the innovation, and I appreciate this process, and especially that it is a data informed process for the decision making. Probably what would be helpful is just to maybe workshop a little bit how do we maintain equity throughout this process, and I think when you talk about innovation and those pieces, that requires money. A lot of times for schools to innovate, probably external money and partnerships. And so when I think about some of the previous presentations that we've had, where we had like the allocation of who's partnering where and how are schools getting access to additional supports, who's at the table, whether even if we look at counselors, we know that Achieve Atlanta is in all of our high schools. If we think about social work, we know we have Chris 180, right? So we have partners, but they're not in all of the places and spaces. And so what exists within this framework for us to guarantee that if we are going to transition a media specialist role, for instance, to something else in one space, that it's equitable and still whatever happens at another school that doesn't have the opportunity for funds or partnerships to transition that into something that is more innovative, that all of our students are still getting that same standard or service.
Yeah. I think you're hitting a couple of different points there. So one has been that challenge of where we align on equity versus equality, right? And so in one definition, for a GO team to make the exceptions at their school that says this is what our student population needs, that is meeting the definition of equity that says, for our school, we are prioritizing A, B, and C. And so we are not going to have D, E, and F because this is what our student needs. And we're going to look different from the school down the road because we are meeting our students' needs. That's equity, right? That is those students getting what they need. And that might look different at a school up the road who is prioritizing D, E, and F, and they are doing trade-offs with A, B, and C. And I hear what you're saying. There are some schools that through partnerships or through resources are able to do A through E, right? Because they're pulling in more. So it's balancing that, right? So I always push back when we say, well, and media specialist is a great example because that's where we went from loose to tight, right? And we took away the flexibility in some schools that were really making it work because there was an impression that it was inequitable that some schools had media specialists and others didn't, right? You talk to those principals, they say, I didn't want it, right? Like I was doing something different and my kids were in the media center using books in a totally different way, right? So we want to make sure that we are actually giving students what they need and not getting too hung up on like this school has this and this school doesn't, right? We have to get comfortable that schools might look different. That's the exercises we started in September, October. We were having conversations about two schools looking differently and how we feel about that. So that's just the first thing. I want to put that caveat out there. Our schools will look different. They will always look different. There will always be a school that has more or less than a different. Hopefully, we're actually leveraging those go teams and site-based flexibilities so that difference is actually targeting a student population at that school, right? And it is getting them what they need. And also, we have to continue to work with our partners. We'll continue to work with our federal programs offices to think about how we leverage those federal dollars and we leverage additional dollars coming into the district to try to expand for all. So that gets to question 4, I think, which is how do we still give schools additional discretionary dollars on top of the baseline, right? So if you have flexibilities with these positions, that's all well and good, but you're still trading off. Is there a way that we can expand through kind of what you're talking about so that there's additional flexibility on top of that? And that's the work we still have to do.
And just to echo that, I think one of the things that's important is when we think about equity is that it's not equal and that every school has a different, I spent about an hour yesterday on Booker T. Washington's Go Team meeting remotely, and they were setting their goals. Now, let me be clear. I'm not going to be doing that a whole lot because I ain't got time. So I need to give a caveat. I did it to get some context about Go Team because there's 72 Go Teams across Atlanta Public Schools. I won't be sitting on all of them. But I did want to sit on that one. Miss Riggins does a really great job, and I also see her out and about. So I said, I don't want to be on one of those. I want to get context. So I took some time yesterday evening to be on a portion of that. So one of the things they talked about were the arts, for instance, and maybe a desire to expand some of their art program, and that was Go Team driven, right? Well, as their principal, begins to look at their allocation and investment, if that's something that they want to stand up, that school leader, as they're building their master schedule, should begin to think about what can I do to, if that's where they're going, to put some resources there. And then I think to the question 4 that was mentioned, then there may still be things above and beyond that the district says, okay, they want to send up they want to make their arts program more robust. They've done some of this. Now let's do some of that on top, right? So the nuance and differences is what makes equity really work. And so I think it's important that we don't say everybody's got to have 16 of these and 12 of those. There should be some nuance and differences.
Yeah.
And that's excellent to hear. And so I guess if a school doesn't have maybe the same experience on their Go Team, like we're also talking about the cluster superintendents actively monitoring and checking in and looking at the needs of every school. So our principals are always gauging that, but just making sure, like you're saying, Jessica, that there's that support for the needs and how you grow that. And I think it's really important how you reference, Dr. Johnson, that the district could lean in that space. Because sometimes Go Teams, some of them have folks who can look at writing grants and things like that, and some do not. And then I also just want to mention, as was discussed during the engagement sessions, just looking into the future and our structure, economies of scale, and what we're able to add as schools grow and develop, and how we're really intentional about looking at the growth and development of all of our schools so that you have sustainable offerings long-term for your students based on what they really need. So I think that's something that the community really needs to think about as well.
Right, and so, yes, so I appreciate the perspective, and I think number 4 kind of answers it for me with that, the way Dr. Johnson described it with the overlay. I just don't want our schools to be different because of lack of access.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
I'm fine with
Yeah.
different needs, but not lack of access. I think that's
Yeah,
my
I think that's
yeah.
a very important caveat.
And let me say this, because this is a space I'm very, like, scheduling, I get really excited about, so y'all have to put the brakes on me. You know, so there's also this real conversation that a principal has with the teacher. So I think regularly about a gentleman named Mr. Gutierrez, who was a tremendous math teacher, and he loved teaching. He loved AP Physics. Well, I used to tell him as principal, that class makes if you get 10. 10 students need to be a part of that class for it to make. And I was that direct because we are dealing in, like, a budget. And he would go out and work and recruit. Like, it's the onus is on a little bit of the school, right? And the teacher to go out and recruit the students to be a part. Because there are students, you know, sometimes we have situations where only 2 or 3 kids raise their hand, but 8 or 9 or 12 or 15 other kids have the potential. And so there's a level of responsibility on the, you know, so he would go out and recruit. Inevitably, if he got to 8 or 9, I'm not going to not fund the class, right? We're going to do the class, and if he does the work, we're going to figure out how to pull it off. But there's some push and pull on some of this that we've got to have, and it can't just be, well, you had 2 students, you know, we're not going to offer it. Like you know, the school's got to do some work, the principal's got to do some work, and the district got to come alongside and do some work, and we got to figure out solutions. The solution isn't necessarily to do blanket across the board equally. We need to figure out what each school needs to address it.
Righty, and then I'll just move quickly through our next few slides. These are just high-level estimates. We have not started building out the school budgets. I'll just give an overview of what our process looks like. When we get back in January, we'll build our SSF formulas and we'll push the allocations into each individual school template. And then this is a behind-the-scenes process, but my team and I will sit down and build every single school's budget and make sure that we can make them balance and that SSF is providing what we would expect it to. The only reason I put these slides in, again, this is not where we will end up, it's just to demonstrate what we're running right now, is to, again, if we think back to some of the slides that we've presented in past years, that is the seesaw between stability and equity. What we're saying is when we're building a baseline, that we want more towards that base student. Every student is going to generate a higher allocation, and you'll have less on the supplementary sides. And so to demonstrate that, one thing that you may see is that we're shifting more of the allocations to grade level weights. So putting a lot more. So if I am a kindergarten student that is also receiving a poverty weight, I'm going to use first grade. So if I'm a first grade student also receiving a poverty weight, last year I would have received 0.25 for my first grade status, and I would have received 0.47 for my poverty status. So this year we're just kind of flipping that a little bit. We're putting more on the grade level status and less on some of the attribute weights. And so that's going to push more into the base allocation so that we can ensure every student has more access to some of all of these programs and then flexibility on top of that. So again, we are still building these out. These will continue to change as we make sure every school is able to meet those baseline allocations. But I wanted to show that up front, how it's going to shift a little bit of the money away from some of the attribute weights towards the grade level weights and base weight.
Do you mind if we pause for a question on that, please? Retta?
So I have kind of 2 questions. And so one with the last thing that you said with basically the shift from the attributes to the base. This would be the second year in a row that we're looking at doing that. And just kind of a general wondering around that, because we did it last year. And we definitely saw some changes. So a curiosity around that change. And then on top of that, there is a curiosity around how we're using our current outcomes to impact this. For example, I know top of mind from looking at the recent data that middle school science saw a dip. And knowing that, not necessarily knowing the roots behind that, is there a space in here that addresses it? Or because we're talking middle school science and that's technically not a part of our goals, it is overall, but it's not literacy, it's not numeracy. Science is actually a combination of them both, if you ask me. So it's like, how are we taking that stuff into consideration in terms of our weighting and our allocations, or are we? And,
don't think
does
you'll
that happen in a different space?
Yeah, I don't think you'll see that as nuanced in the weights. I think you'll see that more in how schools then use those dollars at their school. So it's not in how they're earning it, it's how they're using it. The earning it, we're really trying to focus on is, are schools getting a sufficient amount of dollars to cover a base allocation that we've determined every school should be able to have? And then from that, they'll be able to still use their flexibility to allocate those dollars to target their specific needs at their school.
So maybe the question is, in doing it that way, based on what we know, is there a need to relook at the middle school weighting?
No, not necessarily. It's pretty clear that there's obviously opportunity in science. You really have more of a curriculum issue than it is a personnel, right? Then how many people or resource. It's like an alignment and coherence when you're that far kind of off the mark percentage wise and have a decline. It's an indication in regards to the curriculum guides and what's going on and what's actually being taught. And so the other piece I will mention is that when you look at the CCRPI, the way it's calculated, the weight of science isn't necessarily as heavy, and so there's some of that piece that goes into the pot as well. But you're asking the right. I think you're asking the right questions, and those are the questions that, as the cluster superintendent is sitting with the principal and the principal's thinking through what they have allocated. Those are the back and forth conversations that should be happening, and we would expect to be happening as a part of this process. So it's the right question. I don't think to the earlier statement that this has an impact necessarily on that. No.
Yeah,
So
I think
simply put, it's not how much you spend, it's how you spend it.
Yeah.
That's right, and that's with everything. I mean, like that is with everything, right? And so it's not that we need to go add 3 more teachers in each building for science, right? It's a conversation about time. It's a conversation about task, and really those are the 2 things that we have to look at. And so that's a teaching and learning conversation. But also accountability and assessment can give some more context, and we'll have Joe put together some things around that.
Yeah. And I think our previous presentations where we've shown the per pupil spend at our schools, the per pupil spend at our district compared to other districts, APS doesn't have a lack of resource problem. We have a how we spend it opportunity. So we're, and I think some of that is what we're trying to reconcile by showing what we're allocating and then capturing how they are using that to address their specific needs so we can have that accountability conversation. The last slide that I will talk through is just some of the other changes that we're seeing outside of SSF that will impact the school budgets this year. Enrollment is up in our traditional schools by about 575 students in our projected enrollment, and in some schools we're seeing that we're still seeing decline in other schools, so it is kind of case by case, but overall we are seeing that bump up, which is good. Average salary, you're going to see a big increase in the average salary on the school templates as we capture the raises from last year. So when we built the budgets in January last year, we weren't building with that average salary in place. So schools and Go teams will have a bit of a sticker shock when they go in and see the average salary, but that is capturing the average salary from last year. Benefit rates are up, so this is mostly impacting the classified employees, but some of the state health benefit is being annualized. This year, we had increases in that went into effect, will go into effect in January, and next year you'll see the full cost of that across the year. And TRS rates for the employer contribution is 20.8 last year, 21.91 going into next year, so small increases there, but that adds up. We are, again, seeing school-by-school demographic changes, so as some of those weighted categories shift around, you're going to see the allocations change. And we've talked about this in some of our previous conversations as well, but we are reviewing some of those programs that are on top of SSF. I'll just call out a few that we're looking at. Turnaround, we was about 10.5 million last year. We're looking at how and co-creating with turnaround principals what that allocation might look like in the upcoming year to make sure that we are allocating an amount that is targeted and specific to that program. Continuing to think through signature programs is 18.2 million. Whole Child, which was a one-time allotment we did last year as an ESSER step down. So far, we're not seeing how that it was being targeted and used. And so my current recommendation is that we pull that going into next year and reallocate if needed. Readers or Leaders, the 11.8 million for that, will naturally see some step down in the cost for that. Last year we paid stipends for all of our teachers to get certified. We won't have all teachers being recertified next year, so we should naturally see some decrease on that. Readers or Leaders investment, TBD what that would be. And then also our dual campus, we're looking at what we've allocated to our dual campuses in the past. Overall, that's about a $3.5 million investment. And so there may be some opportunity as we're building budgets to look at those. So those are some of the programs that we're continuing to kind of noodle through. And we may or may not see those on the initial allotment sheets that principals get unless we're able to come up with a strong recommendation when those budgets are released. Our January board meeting, budget commission meeting, will focus on revenue, which is, where that's half the puzzle. And then again, we'll do a deeper dive in state, local revenue, and a TADS deep dive. And we'll bring any updates that we have on the school budgets because those will be in principal's hands by the time we get to January 23rd. So I'll take any final questions that you may have.
I think I'm still noodling with the shift from the base and just a comfort level and because I know the poverty rate did decrease last year and it decreasing again, and us knowing, if I remember correctly from our outcomes, that it is our socioeconomic challenged students with disabilities and students of color that are having challenges. I just want to make sure that we have the resources in the right place. And again, not just the amount, but also then the how.
Exactly.
Even more importantly, I just really want to make sure that we have the resources, and which is what this conversation is about. And then next steps, the plan. Which also, I'm guessing, that turnaround bucket is also something else that, it's been there, but we haven't seen the outcomes, right? It's just
I think you're nailing the why we are doing it this way this year. So in 2019 is when we introduced the poverty weight and targeted $40 million to schools through that poverty allocation. And I don't know that you see a lot of gap closure in any school based on that poverty allocation. I think we're making the case that the inputs alone are not enough, right? So even as we start playing with and targeting the inputs and really trying to get our arms around how we're allocating, and more specifically that we can justify those allocations against a baseline. So we can now say, we've given school, what I've not been able to say since we moved to SSF is I can guarantee every school can afford a 1 to 450 ratio for counselors, right? Because we haven't been building budgets that way. So what we're doing this year is saying APS can guarantee we are funding you a sufficient amount for this, right? So that way we can say, these are the inputs we can guarantee. Schools will still have flex dollars on top of that through their student success funding formula. And they'll still have their turnaround dollars. They'll still have some signature dollars. They'll still have their title dollars. All of those are in addition to everything that we're talking about here. But now what we're hopeful for is, even if it's not 40 million through the poverty weight and it's closer to something like 35 million, again, we're not cutting budgets. It's just going back to the grade level. So there's kids are still receiving it. They're just receiving it through their grade level instead of an attribute. But what we can do is more targetedly say, now that you have these dollars, how are you aligning them to meet your specific goals, which should include closing gaps for kids, right? So if you're receiving $300,000 in your budget for poverty weights, how are you using that $300,000 for those students to close some of the gaps, right? And we have not been able to tightly align their goals and with the data and the inputs of the dollars. So I do think that you'll see some shift in the inputs, hopefully so that we can better align those outputs with outcomes, right? So how they're using the dollars and how that's actually helping to achieve some of the goals at the school level, which will help us achieve our goals at the district level.
That's exciting to hear, and even more exciting for someone who's sitting in a space to see it all, and then, share those best practices. But I love the fact that we're setting ourselves up to be able to use the data to inform decisions. Thank you.
Yeah, and I will say the slides that we've been including with the QR code that shows every school's FY24 to FY25 budgets and how it was allocated, we're building that as a part of the template this year. So when principals go in, they'll see what they earned in 25, how they earned their dollars by funding category, how much they received for poverty weight, and they'll see their 26, and they'll be able to very quickly see, like, oh, my poverty weight went down, but I have more students earning that, so this is the net impact of the dollars. They'll see it all in their budgets, and hopefully that helps them to communicate that to their Go teams as well. And we will have that in a public place so that anybody can see it. It's finance stuff is, sunshine, so it's all available.
And I know we're wrapping up, but I think bullet point 3, demographic changes for some of our schools, which will affect how much money they're getting, which, yes, we need more weights for students who are dealing with poverty, but also knowing that those schools with demographic changes are growing. And again, going back to how we spend our money, like still they have so much money per pupil. We can talk about this obviously more in January, but how are we looking to monitor that actively? Like just planning for the support for those.
Yeah.
So there are several schools in my Board of Education district who have been qualified for Title I, who are either losing it or close to losing it based on demographic changes in their schools, which makes sense. But they're actively growing and getting tight, and this is a longer, bigger conversation for the district structurally. But this is not new. And we've had schools that have been in this situation for a while. But I do hear from the community, and what you're saying about communicating with the Go team very clearly on how funding's allocated. But obviously, a lot of support is needed there too, because that's a change. Just want to put that out there too.
Yeah, and for context, so I've lived situations, and I need to get some more. At least I can have a conversation about this, but I've actually been a part of taking Title I and rolling it back a good bit to make sure that it's impacting. When I say roll it back, to make sure it's targeted towards what it actually was administered to do, which in turn means, and I'm not saying that here for us, but which in turn means that there are a subset of schools that had adverse impact from the standpoint of Title I allocation, but because of how we budget, generally speaking, a lot of times they get caught up in general fund. So you're able to work with them. So at the end of the day, you're able to ensure a soft landing, if you will, for everybody, but also make sure that those targeted dollars go to where those targeted dollars are supposed to go for as far as Title I is concerned. So Yeah, I think those will continue to be conversations that we'll need to have in the days ahead as we look at budget.
And I appreciate that response, just about targeting the students who need that support in those schools, because we need to make sure those gaps are being closed for those kids, not just looking at the overall data, which is important too. Yes,
So that brought up a quick question I need some understanding on. So schools that are on list, they get additional allocations, correct?
Schools that are on lists.
Like the targeted list.
They don't get it from the state. So once upon a time, we received state funding for targeted assistance, and they no longer receive that. So our turnaround dollars, the general,
That's what those
the
are.
locally funded turnaround dollars is what we are allocating on top of their general allotments.
So when we talk about falling off the cliff, when you don't receive those funds anymore, those are turnaround funds and not state funds.
We've really
like,
worked
so-
hard to try to not have any cliffs in our local, where we can control our formulas. We've done really generous step downs as schools have come off lists.
Right. So we've added the step down so it's not such a, but there was a point where you were getting,
That was when we were having state funding,
Okay.
and it was
When did that go
$200
away?
on or last year.
okay,
And
so I'm not that far off. Okay. 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 Thank you.
is that it?
That's it for
Oh,
me.
great. So a reminder, the meeting will be January 23rd, assuming at noon, but that could change, so stay tuned. We'll talk about revenue assumptions, TAD review, how we find the money. I'll just say we're due. With that, any public comment?
Madam Chair, no public comment.
Thank you. So Aretta's asking about with potential opt-out, that right now, we don't have to do anything formal from this commission. It's more that we're giving a green light to enter into the process for the public hearing. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think the administration will bring forward a recommendation at the January board meeting.
But our committee has discussed it, and we have done our part. Cool, but great question.
And I think just to be clear, and correct me if I'm wrong, Lisa, but also heard legal mention this as well. We'll communicate after the January board meeting to the public, right? What we're proposing, considering, and then obviously the sessions and the dates and all that will be a part of those conversations.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. All right, with that, any other business comment? If not, all in favor of adjournment, say aye. Or motion, oops, I'm just skipping ahead. Is there a motion to adjourn today's meeting?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you all. Have a good holiday. See you next year.